everyone, and for your attendance and for the questions. I thank the nominees for being here and for their, again, for their willingness to serve. I'm almost tempted to engage in a little bit of give and take on the constitutional background of the United States Senate, but I'll reserve that for some other time on the floor or something. I've just been involved in trying to get rid of the filibuster for 20-some years, so I do have views on Senate rules and the ability of the minority to block legislation. I would just say very succinctly that I've long felt that there should be a rule for the Senate to be able to slow things down, not to rush to judgment, to be able to have due deliberation so that the rights of the minority are not run roughshod over. But in the end, at some point, the majority must be enabled to act. But it should be the right of the minority to be able to amend, to offer amendments, yes, to be able to slow things down, to get the public aware of what the majority is trying to do, but not to, in the end, be able to absolutely stop something with a minority of the vote. But that's one person's opinion. Again, I thank you all very much. I am hopeful that we can move these nominations very rapidly with the concurrence with our ranking member. I hope to be able to move them sometime very soon. The record will remain open. So the record will remain open for 10 days. Written questions must be submitted by close of business of this Friday, and then we'll keep the record open for the responses to those written questions. But after 10 days, then we'll do our duty and move the nominees. So again, thank you all very much. If you have any, does anyone have anything else they wanted to add before we adjourn? If not,
Thank you for your time, Senators.
Yes, thank you very much.
Just a minute. I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson.
I just said thank you for your time, Senator.
Well, thank you,
Chairman.
Thank you. When? It was Senator Leahy who first said this. Maybe it's been around for longer than that, but he once said that senators are a constitutional impediment to the smooth functioning of staff. I've just learned that we are moving the nominees next Wednesday. Okay. Next Wednesday morning. So thank you. The committee will stand adjourned.
And thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good morning. Here we are in National Women's Health Week, again proclaiming the glories of the Affordable Care Act and what it means to women. I'll talk about that in a moment. When it comes to addressing the urgent needs up for the American people, our priority in Congress is clear. We must create jobs. Unfortunately, House Republicans seem to think that their main responsibility is to do nothing. Oh, for those of you who were here yesterday, you know that I have lost my voice. That may be good news to some. But let's see how far we can go with this. Is to do nothing. Here we are 134 days into the 113th Congress without one vote on a jobs bill. 54 days after the Senate passed its budget. So we still haven't moved forward to the budget process. But this do-nothing agenda does not reflect the priorities of the American people. It is an agenda that only the Republicans seem interested in pursuing. And so you see a series of subterfuges, job evasions. Today's job evasion is that the Republicans have decided to vote on the Patients' Rights Repeal Act, their 37th attempt to repeal our country's landmark health reform bill. That's 37 votes, 43 days, $52.4 million on an obvious evasion. Our responsibility to work on the priorities of the American people. Not only is this a clear waste of time and of taxpayer dollars, it is a deliberate vote to eliminate the affordable quality health and care benefits millions of Americans are already enjoying. For those of you who were with us yesterday, you got the card with many of the provisions that are already in effect in the Affordable Care Act. 105 million Americans are already receiving free preventive services. More than 100 million Americans no longer face a lifetime limit on their health coverage. 17 million children with pre-existing conditions are no longer denied coverage. Soon, being a woman will not be considered a pre-existing medical condition. As you see, these are already in effect, though. Preventive services, coverage for young adults and children, being women. As you know, many more provisions are there. 6.6 million young adults up to the age of 26 have taken advantage of the law to obtain health insurance through their parents' insurance policies. 6.3 million seniors in the donut hole have saved $6.1 billion on their prescription drugs. The list goes on and on. Needless to say, we'll be talking about this on the floor of the House. Not only is this a vote that jeopardizes access to affordable, quality health care,
Alaska.
I request that proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, well, we are waiting for colleagues to come and join us on the floor to speak about the nomination of Dr. Ernest Moniz to be Secretary for Department of Energy. I thought I would take a few moments and fill in my colleagues about a meeting that I just returned from in Kiruna, Sweden. This was the Arctic Council ministerial meeting, and the Arctic Council is comprised of the 8 Arctic nations, of which the United States is one by virtue of the state of Alaska, but not to diminish the fact that we truly are an Arctic nation. And our role as such, involved with other Arctic neighbors, is a growing role, and a role that the rest of the world is looking at with great interest and great anticipation as to how the United States is going to step forward into this important arena. This is the second Arctic Council meeting that I have attended. I was in Nuuk, Greenland, with Secretary Clinton and Secretary Salazar 2 years ago. That was the first time that the United States had sent a cabinet member, sent the Secretary of State to the Arctic Council, and it caused great waves throughout the Arctic world and certainly gained the attention of nations around the world. And the thought was, or the sentiment was, the United States is finally stepping up. The United States is moving forward, recognizing its role as an Arctic nation. So it was exceedingly important that Secretary Kerry continued that good work of Secretary Clinton in leading the U.S. in its role at this ministerial meeting. And I will tell you, Secretary Kerry has been very involved here in this body as a senator in his leadership on certain issues, specifically advancing the Law of the Sea Treaty, ratification of that important treaty, speaking out and being very forthright on the issue of climate change. His leadership at the council meeting in Kiruna yesterday was clearly evidence as he worked to bring the parties together in terms of an agreement to move forward with how we treat observers to the Arctic Council. So I commend Secretary Kerry for his leadership, certainly for his initiative in ensuring that the United States continues to have a high profile and a growing profile. So why is this important? Why do we need to not only be engaged but to step up that engagement? Well, yesterday the chairmanship of the Arctic Council transferred from Sweden to Canada. So our neighbors to the north will chair the Arctic Council for these next 2 years. In 2015, the gavel of that chairmanship will pass from Canada to the United States. So we will be working to set the agenda, although it's a very consensus-driven process. But we will clearly be in a leadership role amongst the 8 Arctic nations and those observer nations. So it's critically important that we're ready, that we be working towards assuming this leadership position. And in doing that, it's more than just attending meetings every other year. It's the agreements that come out as a result of these ministerials, these consensus initiatives that really help to advance the dynamic in an evolving part of the world. In Nuuk, the first ever binding agreement of the parties was entered into, and this was a search and rescue agreement. If there is an incident up in the Arctic and the world up there knows very little in terms of boundaries and what happens with ice, but we recognize our infrastructure is severely limited. So who is in charge? How do we work cooperatively, collaboratively with search and rescue? So it was an exceedingly important initiative that was adopted 2 years ago. Yesterday in Kiruna, it was the adoption of the Cooperation on Marine Oil Pollution Preparedness and Response in the Arctic. There is a recognition that in the Arctic, where some 15% of the world's known oil and gas reserves are situated, that there will be activity. We're seeing it in Russia to our left-hand side. We're seeing it in Canada to our right-hand side. In the United States, as we all know, Shell attempted their first ever, they attempted to begin exploration this year. There have been previous exploration efforts up in the Beaufort and in the Chukchi. Whether you are for or against oil development here in this country, the recognition is that within the Arctic nations, there is activity. There is ongoing efforts, whether it's through exploration or hopefully production, that will move forward. So what we're trying to do within the Arctic Council and other entities is make sure that when that happens, we're prepared. So we're putting forward collaboration and collective agreements so that there's an understanding that in the event, hopefully a very, very unlikely event, something that would never happen, that there is an understanding as to how all the nations act, the level of preparation that moves forward. So incredibly important initiatives as we deal with an evolving Arctic. And think about the world up north there. And really understand what is happening. This is no longer an area that is locked in ice and snow, an area where we are not able to transit, an area where there's no human activity. The Arctic has seen clearly an opening as we see the sea ice receding, we're seeing a level of activity that is unprecedented. It's truly the last frontier, a new frontier, so to speak. And again, how we prepare for a world where there is more movement, where there is more activity, is going to be a critical key to the success and the opportunities. We recognize that the volume of shipping that we are seeing now coming through the Northwest Passage, coming from Russia on down through the Bering Strait, through very narrow channels there, out to Asia, down into the Pacific. There's incredible movement. So how are we preparing ourselves for an increased volume of shipping traffic? Do we have the navigational aids that we need? Do we have the ports and the infrastructure that will be necessary? These are some of the initiatives that were discussed. Obviously, when we think about an Arctic that is changing, key focus on climate change and what is happening. We're seeing the impact of climate change in the Arctic more noticeably than in other parts of the globe. And so there's a great deal of science and research that is going on that's necessary. How we collaborate, how we share that with all of our other Arctic neighbors is going to be key. How we map our resources, whether it's understanding the seafloor, whether it's understanding the coastline. This is an area, again, that we use the term frontier. And when we go out into a new frontier, it's important to know what it is that we're dealing with. So how we can be working cooperatively on things such as mapping. What we can be doing, again, to ensure that as we see changes, as we see development, as we see increased economic activity in the Arctic, that the indigenous peoples, the peoples that have been there for thousands of years, living a true subsistence lifestyle, that their lifestyle remains intact, that there can be a balance and a harmony with their world and this changing scenery and landscape in front of them. A story that was conveyed to me several years ago, I was up in Barrow, which of course is the northernmost city in the United States. And Barrow is a relatively small community, several thousand individuals. One afternoon, there's a group of folks that are in town and they're all speaking German. Somebody asked, well, how did you get here? Where'd you come from? They didn't see that many people getting off the Alaska Airlines jet. And the German tourists pointed to a cruise ship that was offshore. They had lightered these German tourists into the community. A cruise ship in these waters just a few years back was unheard of. What we're seeing now are cruises. We've got a level of tourism that you would never have anticipated. So again, how we prepare for all of this is a challenge for us. So the work of the Arctic Council, again, focusing on collaboration and cooperation in an area, in a zone of peace, as many would suggest. This is an important opportunity for us from a diplomacy perspective. Think about how many hot spots we have in the world, how many parts of this planet we're trying to put out fires that have been simmering or smoldering for decades, for generations, for some millennia. If we've got a part of the world where we can be working together, what kind of a message, what kind of a symbol does that really represent? So we've got some enormous opportunities within the Arctic. I'll tell you, part of my challenge, and I shared this with Secretary Kerry, is impressing upon people in this country that we are an Arctic nation. Madam President, you hail from the state of Massachusetts. My colleague and chairman of the Energy Committee comes out of Oregon. I would venture to say that most of your constituents don't view themselves as people of the Arctic, but we are. As 50 states, we are. And so how we work together to make sure that America's role as an Arctic nation is represented is key. I'll conclude my remarks by noting that just on Friday, the White House released its Arctic strategy. And this is a document to advance national security interests, how we responsibly manage the Arctic ecosystem, how we bolster international relationships, all very worthwhile goals. I think we recognize that it's perhaps a little bit light on details, but the good news is that so many of our federal agencies are working to help advance these goals. What we need, in addition to a coordinated strategy, is a policy that's really going to make sense from all the different levels, whether it's how we deal with the energy, how we deal with the human side, how we deal with the security aspect of it. These are complicated issues. But again, it's an opportunity that is almost unprecedented to be able to take a blank page here and be able to create opportunities, be able to create policies that really begin with a level of collaboration and cooperation. This is what we're hoping to build, not only with our Arctic neighbors, but really beyond that. It was interesting to note the recognition of 6 nations to join as observers: China, India, Italy, Japan, Singapore, and South Korea. Now, no one would ever suggest that these are Arctic nations, but the reason they want to be engaged as observers is they recognize the importance of the Arctic to the rest of the globe. They recognize the importance, whether from a shipping perspective, whether from an environmental perspective, whether from just an opportunity for resource. There is a keen awareness that what is happening in the Arctic is the place, this is the place to be right now. So my urging to my colleagues is to pay attention to not only what is happening in the Arctic, but pay attention to how an increased role in the Arctic impacts you and your constituents in your state. Because whether it's sending goods from one nation to another, this is an opportunity to allow for transit and commerce that it's only been a dream. Whether it's how we access our energy resources, again, in a way that is done responsibly, safe, and with an eye towards environmental stewardship. There are opportunities for us, challenges, yes, but opportunities for us as well. So you will hear me talking much more about our role as an Arctic nation, our responsibilities as an Arctic nation. But I would just ask that you start thinking about where does Massachusetts, where does Oregon, where do you fit in as part of an Arctic nation? With that, Madam President, I thank you and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise to speak in support of the nomination of Dr. Ernest Moniz for Secretary of Energy, a native son of Massachusetts. In voting yes on his nomination, the Senate will confirm someone who is extremely well qualified for the role of Secretary of Energy and someone who is proof positive that the American dream is alive and well. Dr. Moniz is a son to first-generation immigrants to America to Fall River, Massachusetts, a historic city on the south coast of Massachusetts, rich with a history in the textile and garment mills, and now with a bright future in the innovation economy. It was in Fall River where Dr. Moniz first developed his love of science, both at home and in the Massachusetts public schools. With the help of scholarships from his father's labor union, Dr. Moniz was able to attend and receive his Bachelor of Science degree, summa cum laude, in physics from Boston College. From there, Dr. Moniz went on to do even greater things. In Massachusetts, we are grateful for the decades of service he has given to one of the finest institutions, not just in the Commonwealth, but in the world, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, otherwise known as MIT, where he has been a faculty member since 1973. Dr. Moniz has led many groundbreaking initiatives at MIT, including, most recently, serving as the founding director of the MIT Energy Initiative and leading the MIT Laboratory for Energy and the Environment. Through the MIT Energy Initiative, he has been at the forefront of multidisciplinary technology and policy studies on the future of nuclear power, coal, nuclear fuel cycles, natural gas, and solar energy. The initiative has spun out numerous startup companies from the campus labs into the emerging and important clean energy economy. In addition to his many years of service to the Commonwealth, Dr. Moniz also knows his way around this town, which I am sure will serve him well in his new position. He served previously as Undersecretary of the Department of Energy, and before that, Associate Director for Science in the Office of Science and Technology Policy for President Clinton. One of the biggest challenges he will undoubtedly face as Secretary is how to continue critical U.S. investments in emerging energy technologies, including fusion, in the face of a difficult budget climate. While I recognize that as Secretary, Dr. Moniz will need to recuse himself from this particular issue, I strongly support continued DOE funding of the Domestic Fusion Energy Research Program at MIT, the CMOD program, which has for years led in fusion science and is an incubator for the next generation of fusion scientists. Unless additional action is taken by DOE, the CMOD research facility at MIT will be abruptly terminated, and 130 fusion scientists, engineers, graduate students, and support personnel at MIT would also be terminated, and hundreds of millions of dollars invested in this program over the past generation will be lost. Our nation's domestic fusion program simply cannot withstand the proposed reductions without a severe negative impact to our fusion research and our scientific contributions to the international fusion research community. This short-sighted approach could eliminate the ability of the United States to take a lead role in the development of the next generation of energy research. The Department of Energy has significant responsibilities that impact America's economic, energy, environmental, and security future. And it is my strong belief that Dr. Moniz has the ability, knowledge, experience, and vision to be an excellent Secretary of Energy for the people of the United States. I look forward to casting my vote to confirm this brilliant scientist, dedicated public servant, and yes, native son of Massachusetts. Madam President, I yield. Suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President,
Senator from Pennsylvania.
I would ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to talk about a subject, or I should first ask for consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. I rise to speak about the National Labor Relations Board. This is a board and a set of issues we're going to be debating and have begun debate on just recently. It'll be with us for a while, and it's an important debate that we're having. As the Senate considers the National Labor Relations Board member nominations, I think it's very instructive, and I would even say essential, to look back at the history of the board and the National Labor Relations Act, the legislation that created the board, to recall why this board and the act is so important to our economy, our workers, and our businesses. The National Labor Relations Act played a key role in making the United States the prosperous nation we are today, and a properly functioning labor board and a revived, modernized National Labor Relations Act could be key players in a more prosperous future. Congress passed the act in 1935 during the depths of the Great Depression. The National Labor Relations Act legitimized and gave workers the right to join unions. It encouraged and promoted collective bargaining as a way to set wages and settle disputes over working conditions, and it led to a surge in union membership and representation. It's worth remembering as well why the act was passed in the first place. To quote Section 1 of the Act, the inequality of bargaining power between employees and employers substantially burdens and affects the flow of commerce and tends to aggravate recurrent business depressions by depressing wage rates in the purchasing power of wage earners, unquote. I'm quoting in pertinent part, I think the most significant words in that part of the Act are the flow of commerce, how important it is to settle disputes so that we can have a free-flowing commerce and that workers have the rights that they're entitled to. Now, as I said, it was passed in 1935. The economy was reeling. 1/4 of the workforce was jobless. Millions of Americans were poor, hungry, and hopeless. Balancing the bargaining power of employers and employees, Congress hoped to restore the nation to economic prosperity. Giving workers the right to organize and bargain collectively would allow them to stand up to corporate power and demand higher wages, thereby increasing their incomes and their purchasing power. That, in turn, would increase consumption and demand for goods, increasing production, and, in fact, increasing employment. As a former NLRB chairman, Wilma Liebman said, and she wrote this, and I'm quoting, "The law was enacted less as a favor to labor than to save capitalism from itself," unquote. We know that before the New Deal, the federal and state governments, the courts, and the law had all been hostile to the collective rights of workers and their struggles against corporate power. For decades, going back to the late 1800s, the majority of production workers in America's heavy industries had labored, in harsh and often dangerous conditions, for low wages with little security. I know this from my own family's history, but I also know it from the history of my own region of northeastern Pennsylvania, the so-called hard coal or anthracite region of Pennsylvania. Stephen Crane, the great novelist, wrote about the coal mines right around the turn of the century, and actually the coal mines in my home county. And he talked about all the ways that a miner could lose his life in the coal mines. And I'll incorporate for the record that part of Stephen Crane's essay about the coal mines, and I'd ask consent that be made part of the record. I'll make sure that a copy is forthcoming.
Without objection.
When unions sprang up to defend the rights of workers, they were treated as illegal conspiracies, ruthlessly smashed by companies that either used violence or called on the police or military to defend their interests. The unions rarely made more than temporary gains. When America began to industrialize in the 1800s, the relationship between workers and their bosses changed dramatically. Craft work by skilled employees was replaced by mass production, with hundreds or even thousands of people working for a single, impersonal corporation. Giant, powerful entities generally treated their workers like faceless, expendable commodities, inputs into the production process whose cost had to be kept low in order to maximize profits in the incomes of robber barons. And that was certainly true in my home state of Pennsylvania. The corporations amassed enormous wealth, but the employees were mostly left behind with lives of misery and hardship. In Pittsburgh, for example, the western corner of our state, a remarkable in-depth sociological study by the Russell Sage Foundation of the lives of working families in the early 1900s found widespread grinding poverty in child labor, poor health and education, and astonishing levels of work-related injury and illness. In Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh is, with a million residents, more than 500 workers died in industrial accidents in a single year, most of them in the steel mills. The same was true in the coal mines. Give you by way of example, in 1907, 1,516 workers were killed in the coal mines of Pennsylvania. In over about a 98-year period, 31,047 known fatalities in the coal mines of Pennsylvania. If the United States today had a proportional number of occupational fatalities as they had in Pittsburgh when 500 workers died, the number would be 150,000 workers today losing their life on the job. Workers were chewed up and discarded with no workers' compensation system and no hope of suing the corporation for negligence. The law of labor relations was seriously unbalanced. Whereas business owners were able to act collectively, joining together in corporations to be treated as kind of a special kind of person under the law, while escaping individual liability for corporation acts, unions were sometimes treated as criminal conspiracies. Their strikes were considered illegal restraints against trade, and courts intervened to issue injunctions to hold unions liable for the acts of their members. When workers tried to form unions to defend themselves or to win a fair share of the profits, they were usually met by fierce resistance by employers, fueling anger and resentment, often leading to violence. In one of the most famous and, I should say, infamous tragedies involved Carnegie Steel, which for 10 years had a collective bargaining contract with its skilled employees at the Homestead plant, but decided in 1892, during an economic depression, both to cut the employees' wages and to destroy the union. And I won't go into the whole story today, we don't have time, but suffice it to say that the union was crushed completely because of the actions of that steel company and then steel companies after it. Then you move forward in the history. When demand for their products dried up in the Great Depression, many businesses cut both wages and hours, further depressing workers' incomes and purchasing power. In President Franklin D. Roosevelt's first year in office in 1933, he pushed through Congress the National Industrial Recovery Act, one of whose main purposes was to encourage companies to recognize their unions and to bargain with them. FDR and Labor Secretary Francis Perkins were convinced that raising wages and thereby increasing consumer demand was essential to lift the economy and put people back to work. Unfortunately, the entity that the Act created to encourage collective bargaining, the National Labor Board, as it was called at the time, had no power to compel the compliance with the new law. Union membership soared, but the companies continued to resist collective bargaining or recognize sham company unions they controlled, effectively bargaining with themselves rather than with the real representatives of the workers. Instead of an orderly, efficient act, or system, I should say, the Act produced chaos. The Supreme Court ruled that the Act was beyond the powers of Congress under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So what happened then? Well, Senator Robert Wagner of New York started over and drafted the National Labor Relations Act of '35. It passed quickly and survived constitutional challenge in the Supreme Court. The new law required companies to recognize unions as the exclusive representative of their employees when they could prove majority representation. It gave the new board the authority to conduct elections and to order companies to bargain in good faith over wages and working additions. It outlawed sham company-owned or company-dominated unions, and it protected employees from violations by employers of their right to join a union or to engage in strikes or other protected concerted activities such as hand-billing or picketing. The board itself was given the power to require employers to hire back fired workers to pay lost wages with interest and to agree not to break the law in the future. For a time, the new law worked. As Wilma Liebman said, the National Labor Relations Board, she was on the board, I should say, for 14 years, she said recently, quote, "Over the next decades, millions of workers voted for union representation and NLRB conducted elections. and millions achieved a middle-class way of life through collective bargaining and agreements that provided for fair wages and benefits in major industries of the economy," unquote. At the peak of union power, 35% of workers were covered by union contracts. They won higher wages, job security, and other benefits, and American family incomes grew by an average of 2.8% per year from 1947 to 1973. Let me say that again. Almost a 3% increase in family incomes from 47 to 73, with every sector of the economy seeing its income roughly double. Due to a number of factors, union membership as a share of private sector employment has declined from that 35% to less than 7% today. So we know that our history tells us not only is the act important for union members and for their families, but it's also very important for the middle class. No one thinks that the National Labor Relations Board by itself will be able to restore balance to America's incomes or restore the purchasing power of the middle class. But the board itself can help make a difference, especially if Congress repairs decades of damage to the rights of unions and employees to organize, bargain, and if necessary, to in fact strike. The Employee Free Choice Act would have been a good start in that campaign of repair and restoration. Tens of millions of Americans today are working at poverty wages. By one estimate, 28% of workers are paid at a poverty-level wage or less. People who work hard for a living deserve a path to a decent economic future. Workers today are better off than the average worker surveyed in Pittsburgh 100 years ago, as I cited earlier. But their lives are getting harder every year, and they are not sharing in our ever-growing national wealth. I hope we can begin a process of reviving collective bargaining soon. But first, we must end the disgrace of leaving the nation's most important labor relations agency without leadership. It is shameful if we allow this to continue to happen. The recent record of obstruction of nominations in the Senate is, in a word, unacceptable and should be unacceptable to every American. It's time to confirm the President's nominees to the National Labor Relations Board to give certainty to workers and to business as we continue to recover and create jobs. Mr. President, as I leave, I would go back to the few short words I'll read from the opening findings and policies in the National Labor Relations Act. Quote, "Experience has proved the protection by law of the rights of employees to organize and bargain collectively safeguards commerce from injury, impairment, or interruption, and promotes the free flow of commerce by removing certain recognized sources of industrial strife and unrest." And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from South Dakota.
I ask that the quorum call be dispensed with and that I be allowed to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, yesterday morning I called for the immediate resignation of Acting IRS Commissioner Stephen Miller in light of the IRS's admission that it had targeted conservative groups for inappropriate scrutiny. While I was willing to give Mr. Miller and other IRS officials the benefit of the doubt until the facts were in, the Treasury Inspector General report released on Tuesday has erased any doubts as to the severity of the misconduct and blatant incompetence in dealing with it at the highest levels of the IRS. I'm pleased that President Obama chose to heed the call that I made and others as well by dismissing Mr. Miller last night. This is a necessary step, but only a first step toward restoring the credibility and the integrity of the IRS. This scandal is much larger than any one official within the IRS. Any government official who knew about the misconduct within the IRS and decided not to make this information public should be held accountable. No American taxpayer should ever have to worry that a group they belong to or a view that they espouse will subject them to less favorable tax treatment by their government. Yet the IG report has unfortunately confirmed this political profiling is exactly what happened. The misconduct by the IRS is troubling for a host of reasons. But there are two questions yet to be answered. that I find particularly troubling. First, how was the improper targeting of IRS agents allowed to continue for more than 18 months before it was finally brought to an end? Secondly, how did the internal IRS process involve so many high-level IRS officials, yet remain hidden from the public and from Congress for more than 2 years? Former Commissioner Miller was quoted yesterday as saying the IRS misconduct was a result of 2 rogue employees in Cincinnati who were overly aggressive. Yet we now know from the IG report that the IRS's attempt to deal with the targeting of conservative groups went through numerous high-level IRS officials in Washington. We know that as early as March of 2010, IRS officials in Washington were involved in applying special scrutiny to Tea Party and other applications with conservative-sounding names. According to the IG report, the head of the IRS Exempt Organizations Division and the IRS Chief Counsel became aware of this targeting almost 2 years ago, in the summer of 2011. Let's be clear. The scandal here isn't simply a few rogue employees. The real scandal is an entire bureaucratic structure within the IRS that allowed this targeting to go on for 18 months. Behind me, Mr. President, is the organizational chart from the IG report showing all the offices that were involved in dealing with the improper targeting of conservative groups. As you can see, of the 12 offices on this chart, only 2 of these offices are based in Cincinnati. The other 10 offices are in Washington, D.C. This particular office here was the office that the current acting, or until just last night, acting Commissioner Stephen Miller held. But as you can see, Mr. President, this is lifted directly from the Inspector General's report. This is an organizational chart that suggests that the 2 offices in Cincinnati were a small part of a much bigger web of offices and individuals that were involved with this. Yet this situation, even though it may have started with a few rogue employees in Cincinnati, but the idea that somehow it was confined to that one small part of the IRS is simply untrue. It's also misleading to suggest that the IRS has been anything other than secretive and resistant to calls for greater transparency when it comes to the agency's handling of conservative groups. We now know that then Deputy Commissioner Miller was made aware of inappropriate targeting of conservative groups as early as May of 2012. Yet for a year, Mr. Miller did not bring this information to the attention of the public or Congress. In June and August of 2012, I joined with fellow Republican senators on the Finance Committee in sending letters to the IRS regarding reports that the IRS was requiring conservative 501c4s to disclose their donors and expressing concerns that the IRS may change regulations affecting these groups in response to political pressures. The IRS responses to these letters did not acknowledge any special treatment of conservative groups. In November, Mr. Miller became the acting IRS commissioner. And in this capacity, he testified before the Senate Finance Committee regarding the issue of tax fraud and ID theft. He did not take this opportunity to make remarks or to comment on the subject of targeting conservative groups. Time and time again, high-level IRS officials deliberately avoided disclosing information regarding the targeting of conservative groups. Mr. President, the American people deserve to know that action will be taken to ensure the IRS will never participate in this kind of partisanship again, and they deserve to know that leaders of such agencies will be held accountable for such breaches of trust. These actions undermine the confidence the American people have in the IRS to objectively and transparently administer our nation's tax laws. These actions by the IRS are a continuation of a troubling trend from the self-proclaimed most transparent administration in history. All of these incidents are beginning to add up to a growing credibility gap between this administration under President Obama and the high standard of public service that the American people deserve. And now, thanks to Obamacare, the IRS will also be administering parts of the health care law. The IRS's power will grow as they become responsible for determining whether Americans have satisfied the government mandate to have health insurance and whether the government will pay for part of that coverage through refundable tax credits. As noted by the national taxpayer advocate Nina Olson, Obamacare is, and I quote, the most extensive social benefit program the IRS has been asked to implement in recent history, end quote. And Mr. President, as I previously mentioned, this isn't the only Obamacare-related scandal that's come to light this week. Over the weekend, the Washington Post reported that Secretary of Health and Human Services Kathleen Sebelius has been soliciting donations from healthcare executives to fund left-leaning organizations that are trying to work hand-in-hand with HHS to enroll individuals in Obamacare exchanges. If these reports are accurate, the actions taken by the Secretary represent a serious conflict of interest. Companies and organizations should never be pressured for money because it sends the message that contributions are necessary to secure favorable regulatory decisions, creating a pay-to-play environment. Earlier this week, David Axelrod, a former senior advisor to President Obama, said that it isn't possible for the President to be aware of all these problems in government because government is simply too big. Well, it's mind-blowing to consider how large the federal government is and how the one individual responsible for this $3.6 trillion entity can't even keep tabs on all the activity. Perhaps, Mr. President, this is exactly why we should be focused on policies that shrink the size of government so it can be more transparent and more accountable to citizens in this country. Chief Justice John Marshall, in the seminal opinion McCulloch versus Maryland, wrote, and I quote, "The power to tax is the power to destroy," end quote. Those words still ring true nearly 200 years later. This administration is using one of its greatest powers, the power to tax, to destroy one of the people's strongest God-given rights, the right to free political speech. This isn't just an attack on certain conservative groups. It's an attack on all of our rights to assemble and to express free political speech without the fear of repercussion from our government. Mr. President, President Obama has a long ways to go to restore public confidence and to stop the growing credibility gap that so far has plagued his second term. I look forward next week, as we have on Tuesday, an IRS oversight hearing at the Finance Committee, where I hope we can begin the process of reining in a government agency that has run amok. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I have 7 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would yield the floor and ask for the calling of the quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Good morning. Here we are in National Women's Health Week, again proclaiming the glories of the Affordable Care Act and what it means to women. I'll talk about that in a moment. When it comes to addressing the urgent needs for the American people, our priority in Congress is clear. We must create jobs. Unfortunately, House Republicans seem to think that their main responsibility is to do nothing. Oh, for those of you who were here yesterday, you know that I have lost my voice. That may be good news to some. But let's see how far we can go with this. Is to do nothing. Here we are 134 days into the 113th Congress without one vote on a jobs bill. 54 days after the Senate passed its budget. We still haven't moved forward to the budget process. But this do-nothing agenda does not reflect the priorities of the American people. It is an agenda that only the Republicans seem interested in pursuing. And so you see a series of subterfuges, job evasions. Today's job evasion is that the Republicans have decided to vote on the Patients' Rights Repeal Act, their 37th attempt to repeal our country's landmark health reform bill. That's 37 votes, 43 days, $52.4 million on an obvious evasion. Our responsibility to work on the priorities of the American people. Not only is this a clear waste of time and of taxpayer dollars, it is a deliberate vote to eliminate the affordable quality health and care benefits millions of Americans are already enjoying. For those of you who were with us yesterday, you got the card with many of the provisions that are already in effect in the Affordable Care Act. 105 million Americans are already receiving free preventive services. More than 100 million Americans no longer face a lifetime limit on their health coverage. 17 million children with pre-existing conditions are no longer denied coverage. Soon, being a woman will not be considered a pre-existing medical condition. As you see, these are already in effect, though. Preventive services, coverage for young adults and children, being women. As you know, many more provisions are there. 6.6 million young adults up to the age of 26 have taken advantage of the law to obtain health insurance through their parents' insurance policies. 6.3 million seniors in the donut hole have saved $6.1 billion on their prescription drugs. The list goes on and on. Needless to say, we'll be talking about this on the floor of the House. Not only is this a vote that jeopardizes access to affordable, quality health care, is it a vote that explodes the deficit. I don't know if I have a copy of the letter, but just yesterday, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office told Speaker Boehner that repealing the Affordable Care Act would increase the deficit by $109 billion over the next 10 years. $109 billion. Instead of evading job creation, House Republicans should spend every day working to strengthen the middle class. It's time for Republicans to live up to their call for regular order. We were there with the President. They said what they wanted was regular order. Music to our ears. For those of you who don't know what regular order is and want to be reminded, it means you pass a bill from committee, you go to the floor, you pass it in the committee, on the floor in both houses, and then you go to conference table. In order to go to the conference, you have to have appointees. And so we want to appoint conferees. Republicans have said no to that. You're getting lucky. I'm losing my voice. But this is really, they used the excuse that the Senate had not passed a bill. 53 days ago, the Senate passed a bill. So we're long overdue to go to the table. And why is that important? It's important because that so much is at stake. We have 750,000 jobs have been lost by sequestration. You know the other list. 400 million Meals on Wheels, tens of thousands of children thrown off Head Start. Now their parents cannot be parents earning while children are learning. The list goes on and on, not to mention also what it does to the security of our country, which even Senator McCain has said is insane. So one way to get rid of the sequestration is to go to the table and to come to terms, to reconcile differences, to have a budget that creates jobs, that reduces the deficit, does so in a balanced way, and gets rid of sequestration. How can you call for regular order and not take yes for an answer? Must be held accountable.
I would ask to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I've been watching today as various speakers have come to the floor, and I want to just join in the outrage about what has happened over there at the IRS. The idea that the IRS would pick specific groups and target them